When it comes time for Java to talk to a database, the most common, and I'm going to say only, but the most probable way you're going to do that is through something called the Java Database Connectivity, JDBC. So JDBC is Java's way of streamlining how your application will talk to a database. Database has been used for code for a long time. Most of the time, when I pick a database, that database will give you some library that's used with your language. And so, as you were writing your code, let's go back a couple decades, you would be using Oracle's library to communicate in C, or DB2's library to communicate through COBOL, or whatever language and database combination you'd be using. When Java came along, it said, you know what? One of the biggest problems we have with code is if I want to change databases, I have to change libraries, I have to change the way I communicate, I have to do all this plumbing issues around that. So instead, let's create a way where we can have a common approach for your Java software to communicate to any database that's out there. We can say all Java should talk to a database using this common approach called the JDBC, Java Database Connectivity. Now, the way we can do that is we can take advantage of this thing called ANSI SQL. So the structured query language is SQL, and ANSI is the American National Standards Institute, I think is what it stands for. And in 1988, it created this way of defining how we query databases. And so in Java, I can take that standard SQL and I can pass that through JDBC to whatever database I happen to be talking to, and coming up with a way of transporting commands to a database and retrieving data back from a database. Because remember, in Java, I have standard data types. I have known data types. I can pull data back in. I have now a standard interface by which I can send and receive data from general databases. The way this happens is through the magic of interfaces. The JDBC API comes from a package called java.sql. And there's, at the time I wrote this, it was 16 major interfaces that was part of that. There could be more, could be less at this point. Java's gone through many variations. I haven't looked it up recently. And there's a handful of them that we're going to talk about here, and it's primarily the ones you're going to use in order to interact with the database. Now, behind the scenes, what's happening is each database driver that could be created by a vendor, or it could be created by some standard tool supply. There are many database drivers for Java. One, I think that's, if it's still popular, was C3PO. I don't remember what it stands for, but just like the Star Wars character, it's a standard way to talk to databases from Java. And the drivers then would have some sort of proprietary information about how do you talk to Oracle or MySQL or DB2 or SQL Server or whatever it's going to come up with, whatever different Sybase, whatever different database you might be talking to. Generally, though, it's up to the vendor to provide this. You'll have some driver that the vendor provides to talk to their database, because they're the one who knows the inner workings. They're the ones who can optimize it. They're the one who has the best interest in ensuring that this implementation is efficient, effective, and correct as it's going through there. So when I go through and build an application, I include the standard Java package, which includes java.sql inside here. So it comes with every implementation of Java. And then I also need to include the driver. So getting started in JDBC is pretty straightforward. We're going to come into it, and we're going to start with this driver package. It's a jar file, typically. It gets bundled into the class path somewhere, and then it loads itself as it's asked for. So I say, hey, include this in the path, and then it gets itself ready. And the way I ask for it is I go to the connection inside of here, and to get a connection, I go to the driver manager and ask it to get a connection. And I do that through this fancy URL inside of here. So jdbc://mysql:// It's just like http://. It's a universal resource locator, URL. But now I'm asking the protocol is JDBC. I'm talking the dialect of MySQL. I'm going to localhost, which is my computer right here, into the registrar database inside of here. And then I have a username, password I pass along. So this gets me to the database, which establishes for me something called a connection. That connection then is really important because the connection to the database is what allows me to do work in the database. So in order to manage a connection, I need to understand the purpose of a connection. The connection isn't just, like we talked about in sockets, a way of connecting to it, but it's kind of a library book, a library card, to get me access to that thing. That connection allows me to get to the database, just like a library book, a library card allows me to check out books from there, but it doesn't allow me to keep it forever. A socket basically stays open as long as I'm sending data and it's willing to receive data. A connection, it stays open for a long time, but at some point the server's going to stop listening to me. Because when I connect to a database, it's very configurable. I don't want you to connect it and stay for years and years and years. I want you to be able to have many people come in and connect to my database, potentially. That's the way it's thought of. So I get a connection, I can do some information with that connection, and eventually that connection goes away. So it's just something to be aware of. It's actually not something as a programmer you'll have to deal with very much because it's a configured option. It's something that's going to be managed outside of the day-to-day code, but just as you're doing your work. Like, let's say you start up a program, you leave it running, you go to sleep for the night, you wake up the next morning and it says something about connection timed out or access denied. That's kind of what it means. That's probably what your database is going to do, depending on how you have it set up and configured. Now, the important thing about the connection is how do I find it? How do I get it? Because remember, the database is not part of our Java program. There are built-in-ish Java databases. There's one called Jdbc that you can use. That's not what we're going to be doing here. We're going to be using MySQL. But the database here is driven by each of these pieces. So I need to know the protocol. That's the Jdbc right there. So Jdbc as opposed to HTTP, as opposed to web services, as opposed to however else I might communicate over the internet. And then I have the sub-protocol based off of what it is. So this is SQL Server here. So Microsoft SQL Server right there. It could be MySQL, could be Oracle, could be DB2, could be Sybase. This basically identifies which driver am I going to load up. When I say MySQL, it's going to load the MySQL driver for this. Then, as you can see here in yellow, I have the host name and the port number that's happening here. Localhost port 1112. We have a different port when we get into MySQL. And then I have the employee data that's going to be coming up inside of here. That's going to be another name of the database. I've got a couple different ones here, but you'll have a different database based off of what gets created. You'll get the file for this and be able to create this here, as well as it's one of the files that you'll have out there is creating the database. So this is the URL which gets us connection to the database. It's what tells us where am I going to go. It also typically requires a username and password. That's going to be part of the protocol, part of the call you're going to make, as we saw a minute ago. But this is what gets me to the connection. And then once I have the connection, it's established. Essentially, it's like connecting to a Wi-Fi. The world's your oyster. You can do whatever you want to on the internet at that point. So establishing the connection is kind of like putting in your Wi-Fi access code here, and then you're ready to go. I need to know which Wi-Fi SSID I'm connected to, and then what's the password. Well, similar here. I need to know the connection information. From the connection, then, I can do additional work. We're going to look at that here in a minute, but at this point, the key is just getting the database installed, writing this initial connection, and then making the connection. And there's going to be a demo here that's going to show you, to be real quick, real simple, just a couple lines of code, but show you how you can confirm all that stuff's working. If you can't get that piece working, it doesn't matter how great the rest of your code is, nothing else will work. So we want to make sure, pretty much right now is what I would recommend you do is go off and do that demo. Make sure you have the database installed. Make sure you have the permissions set up properly. Make sure you've created the database on your server, and then write a little bit of Java code to make sure you can connect to it. But you don't have firewall issues, or you have the right driver installed, all that sort of stuff. And then everything else fundamentally should be downhill. Because remember, at this point, we're not living entirely in your code anymore. You could write code that's perfect. I've had students send their code to me. It runs just fine on my machine. It doesn't do a thing for them because the environment isn't set up right. The database isn't set up right. The permissions aren't set up right. Whatever it's going to be. So that's a little bit of a trick. And again, I'm going to encourage you to go off and check out that demo right now.